Well, one of the things that always troubles me and as a TV critic is when you get into a discussion of Dark Shadows, one of the things that people immediately come up with is today. Not so much 30 years ago, 20 years ago, but today. Now that the series is readily available on DVD and VHS and has been repeated as many times as it has, you get people immediately saying, well, all the mistakes, all the goofs which happened. And yes, there are there. There's no question that if you want to, but it's sort of like an argument. It's almost like a political correctness argument where you try to gauge something that happened in the 1920s by today's standards. People forget what television was like during that time. First off, most people weren't even watching it in color. Most people were watching it in black and white, even when it went to color. It was a grainy black and white image, and I remember watching it, and I remember not noticing the mistakes. When people started to talk about the mistakes was when they were seeing it in reruns and seeing it for the second and third time. So number one, you have the issue of what soap opera gets repeated. Dan's argument to the actors was always, nobody's going to ever see it again. It was a sound argument at the time. Who ever thought it would be? And who watches any soap opera from that era at this point? Does anybody watch reruns of As the World Turns or Guiding Light from 1967? And if you did, you know what you're going to find? A lot of mistakes. You're going to find it's just that this was the one that got repeated. So that's one argument that always bothers me. It troubles me. Secondly, another thing that even other TV critics don't understand was how ambitious Dark Shadows was for its time. How many standing sets they used. The fact that they were using chroma key. They were using special effects. They were using fire on the set. They were doing things that no other soap opera was doing. Most soap operas had 4 or 5 standing sets. Dark Shadows had this whole world and another world and a parallel world and the past. It was an amazingly ambitious show for its time. And so some mistakes occurred? You bet they did. This was on the run constantly. They were reaching for the stars with every single episode. And the third thing is that no matter how bad a mistake was, you show me the episode where you think this is some of the most egregious mistakes were, I'll show you a moment in that episode that'll just take the top of your head off. And I can remember that. I can remember a scene just going terribly where they were obviously lost. It was Jonathan and Grayson and the actor who was playing Dr. Lang, and they were kicking it all around. They were just butchering the scene completely. And the scene ends on a moment between Jonathan and Grayson, and they both just turned it on. And it was a moment where the two of them connected, and they made it just work, and you just forgot everything else. You forgot everything else in the magic of this moment and these two characters interacting with each other. And that's what Dark Shadows could do. It could turn on a dime and deliver a moment like no other soap opera would have delivered in television, and that's why we do continue to watch it. Anybody who says they're watching it for the mistakes or to laugh at it or something like that, that's not why people continue to watch it all these years later. They continue to watch it because something very, very magical happened in the course of the development of that show, and that magic, for all of how old it looks, how small the sets look, how cheesy the special effects look, somewhere, and you have to say it's in the performances, the magic still works. And that really is remarkable, that after all these, and I don't think you probably could take any soap opera from that time, and that would be the case. Without Barnabas, I mean, he is such a great character. He is such an endlessly fascinating character, and I don't think he gets his due in either in vampire literature because he was on a soap opera. He didn't come out of a book. He didn't come out of a movie. And I don't think Barnabas kind of gets the respect that he deserves. I don't want to make him out to be the Rodney Dangerfield of vampires here, but in essence, he's a very, very important character. And this isn't original to me, but somebody once said that if you stop somebody in the street and you ask them to name 3 vampires, actually just name 3 vampires. The 3, if they could do it, would probably be unquestionably Count Dracula, the vampire Lestat, because of Anne Rice's tremendous influence, and Barnabas. And today maybe they'd come up with Angel. Maybe they would actually come up with a fourth. But it shows you how very, very few vampire characters actually make the jump. And it's interesting that those would be the three, because they create a line, a bloodline, if you will. Is Dracula is Predator, Barnabas is the character who changes it completely, and Lestat is the character who builds on all the innovations that Dark Shadows had. And again, you wouldn't have it without Dark Shadows. And then you see all of the people who were influenced by Dark Shadows. We were talking before about the fact that Dark Shadows was so influential because it kept horror going in the 1960s. It's also influential in the fact of how many people were influenced by it. It's hard to talk to anybody who does horror or any kind of supernatural literature or television post 1970 who doesn't tell you they were influenced by Dark Shadows. So that's the another thing, is that you see the influence in almost everything that everybody does out there. So that's another very, very important thing. You knock Dark Shadows out from the pop culture in the 1960s, and an awful lot disappears afterwards. Well, one thing that always kind of bothers me, and we've been talking about this whole thing with the horror genre, is that it doesn't get the respect that it deserves. You know that if you labor in the vineyards of the supernatural, you're, to many people, considered you're in the sub-basement of literature or television. And that I don't know where we got to that point, because some of the greatest writers throughout history were horror writers. Hamlet's a ghost story. Christmas Carol's a ghost story. Dickens and Shakespeare were horror writers. Robert Louis Stevenson was a horror writer. Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker were horror writers. This is not a badge of dishonor, but it has become that way because I think for some people horror has become interchangeable with the term slasher. And I think that's too bad, because horror is really about great themes, life and death themes, things that affect talk to the human condition. And nobody understood that more than Dan Curtis. Nobody understood that. People sort of talked about him being television's master of menace, the master of the macabre. And in essence, I think what Dan understood, and if you look at, he went to the great works of literature, not only for his inspirations for things like Dark Shadows, but also in the movies that he made, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and his Dracula. And these stories are timeless stories because they do talk about big life and death issues and the confronting of evil, which is a theme which becomes more relevant with each passing day in this country. And that's why horror is timeless, and why it never goes away, and why we still continue to read the stories of old. And there are aspects of the Bible which are horrific and use the basic tenets of horror storytelling. Now, that's the reason that's to me is that's one of the reasons Dan is such a great. It's no mistake that later on he confronts the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust in The Winds of War and War and Remembrance. He has that understanding as a filmmaker, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves. I think because people who do horror literature and do horror entertainment don't, but they should. Because somewhere in this country, we got a stranglehold on what was literature and what was acceptable literature or acceptable entertainment. And somewhere along the line, the New Yorker decided that some writers, some professors' midlife crisis in Ann Arbor was acceptable literature, but that horror stories weren't. Well, I've got news for you. If you want to have any shot 100 years from now of knowing what America was like in the 1970s, you're going to have to read Stephen King, because you're not going to get it from that literature that the New Yorker was talking about. Stephen King is the only one who is writing about day-to-day living. What was life like down at the 7-Eleven? What was life like down at the local supermarket? Stephen King gives us that document, not those people who we consider great, the acceptable literature. And Stephen King will tell you that Dan Curtis had an influence on him.